fleet. Actually, I came to listen as much as I came to talk. I definitely want to hear if you all have comments or thoughts or questions about what's going on in Washington. So I have two things to say about Washington. One, I just want to brag about my bosses a little bit. First, my direct boss is Energy Secretary Stephen Chu, who some of you might know. He's really an amazing guy. And I say that not just because he hired me, but he, much more significant than that, he won the 1997 Nobel Prize in physics. He's a pretty extraordinary person to have as a cabinet secretary. And it's really been a privilege to be able to work for somebody of that enormous skill, and a real tribute to President Obama that he picked him for this position. And I think Secretary Chu is a transformational leader at the Department of Energy. I arrived with him, so I wasn't there beforehand, but sometimes, particularly in that first year, I sat in these budget meetings, and I watched these people who were definitely not used to defending their budgets to a Nobel Prize winner who knew more about what they were working on than they did. So I mean, it's really been an interesting experience. And Secretary Chu he's not only a brilliant scholar, that's kind of obvious, but he also is a very good manager. Right before this job, he was manager of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is a $500 million a year operation. So he brings a lot of management skill to this, and he's also just a very nice guy, I have to say. So he's been great. And then President Obama, who has just shown a steady commitment to this whole clean energy area that I worked in. Within 1 month of coming into office, President Obama signed the American Recovery Act, the stimulus legislation, which is, and it's not widely known, this was the biggest energy bill in U.S. history. And it included $90 billion for clean energy investments, which we've been investing in electric vehicles and in solar and wind and energy efficiency and a variety of other programs, creating jobs and promoting clean energy around the country. He also broke what was literally a 20-year deadlock in this country for the fuel efficiency of our vehicle fleets. I mean, it's amazing if you look at the fuel efficiency of vehicles in Europe, if you look at the fuel efficiency of vehicles in Asia, the United States is just way, way below that. We're a terrible underperformer, and there was a 20-year deadlock in terms of fuel efficiency standards, which President Obama, within 3 months of coming to office, negotiated new CAFE standards, bringing car companies, environmental groups, labor unions, states together for the most significant improvement in 20 years, and then actually just did it again, just announced another improvement. So now we're going to go up to 54.5 miles per gallon for our vehicle fleets, and lots more. Yeah. I want to close with a word about what I think is the most important sustainability issue out there. There's lots of them, and it's kind of hard to, without denigrating any other issues, I think the most significant issue out there is climate change. And it's because I think we are, as a species, fundamentally changing the chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that are extremely troubling and dangerous for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. The science on this is clear. The Earth has warmed over the course of the past century by at least 1 degree Fahrenheit. The physics is clear. It's greenhouse gases that human beings are putting into the atmosphere that are causing this. We have for about 200 years now been pulling coal and oil out of the ground, burning it. When you burn it, it creates carbon dioxide, and we've seen the concentrations of that go up. We know that carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas. By the way, Venus, it turns out, is warmer on the surface of Venus than it is on the surface of Mercury. I've been spending time around scientists, so I apologize for this. But Venus, as people here will remember, is actually further from the sun than Mercury. Why is Venus warmer on the surface than Mercury is? It's because Venus is filled with the atmosphere of Venus is carbon dioxide. It's filled with carbon dioxide. It's a nice day on Venus, about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And actually, interestingly, Venus and Earth have roughly the same amount of carbon, but in Earth, the carbon has been, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, living beings have breathed that carbon, put it into the Earth, died. It's now a part of the Earth's crust, and so it's not warming the atmosphere. In Venus, that carbon is all in the atmosphere. It's capturing heat. It's a bit of a digression, but there's no question that CO2 is a major greenhouse gas. There's no question that we're combusting it at unsustainable rates, and there's no question that it's already having an impact on the planet. We see every year around the Earth for the past decade, we're breaking new heat records everywhere around the world, by the way, at a much faster rate than cold records are being broken. We see climate disrupted, and ironically, one of the predictions from global warming is that both droughts and floods speed up and intensify. It speeds the hydraulic cycle to have all this heat trapping in the atmosphere, so you see more droughts and more floods. And the data is really clear that that is exactly what's happening. So as kind of to report from Washington some kind of good news and bad news on this. I think the bad news is that although a lot of people fought for it, we did not pass legislation in Washington to put a price on carbon. It was a priority of President Obama's. He continually talked about the need to put a price on carbon, but the bad news is it didn't happen now. It's interesting in our political system. If you polled the American people, more than half of them said they were for putting a price on carbon and controlling climate change. If you asked the House of Representatives, more than half of them said they were in favor of it. In fact, they passed a bill called the Waxman-Markey bill that would have done this. If you polled the Senate, more than half of the senators were for it. But in our system, you need 60 votes in the US Senate today in order to get legislation passed, not 50. So you had a situation in which you had more than half of the Americans, more than half of the House of Representatives, more than half of the Senate, and the President of the United States all for this. But we didn't get the law. Ladies and gentlemen, these types of fights are never easy. And so my main message on this topic is we can't give up the hope and we have to keep pushing. We have to keep pushing for a world in which we're responsibly addressing the topic of climate change. I think we're going to be able to do that. I hope we're going to be able to do that in Washington over the course of the next years ahead. If Washington doesn't do it, then we need to do it in the States. We need to do it around the world. And I'll just actually close with a story on this. I should close with two stories. I've had the great privilege in my career of working twice in government. The first time I was in government, I was in the White House in the 1990s, and I was on the National Security Council staff. And one of my jobs, almost literally, was to go around, and whenever the president had a meeting with foreign leaders, the National Security Council always gives him the memo that suggests what he should say. And I was the guy in charge of energy and environment issues. And so I would go to the people in charge, and I would say, when the president meets with this head of state, he should talk about global warming. And when I first got there, like in the mid-90s, people would look at me and say, why? Are you crazy? Why? He's got important things to talk about. Why would he talk about global warming? And these were like, kind of the career professionals who've been working in this area for a long time. By about 1997, around the time of the Kyoto conference, by the way, these people figured out that President Clinton wanted to talk about global warming, that it was on his mind, and so that made it a lot easier. And sometimes President Clinton would complain that he didn't have the points on global warming. After that, my job got a lot easier. But that was the mid-1990s. Then, 2 years ago, I was at the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, where, amazingly, I sat in a room much smaller than this one, where 25 heads of state sat around and negotiated a climate change treaty. And it wasn't everything that we wanted. But I sat in that room and I looked, and there were literally, it was amazing. I mean, the head of the United Kingdom, of France, and by the way, Sarkozy was an amazing, charismatic guy. I'd never been in the same room with him before, but he stood up with kind of French aplomb and talked about, we must take on this issue of global warming. But it kept on going and on, and you don't get to a point in the world where 25 heads of state sit in a room and talk about an issue unless publics all over the world are paying attention to it. And that's not enough, but it gives me hope. It gives me hope that we can really take on this issue, because all around the world, there's real awareness of this. I want to just end with a slide of amazing transformation, kind of going back to where I started in terms of how much things can change. So when I was younger, I studied Chinese, which is a very hard language. I never really mastered it. You've really got to live in China for a long time, but it's really extraordinary. language. And I had the great privilege in the early 1980s, I was part of the first group of, one of the first group, not the first group, but one of the first groups of exchange students to go over to, we lived in Shanghai in the early 1980s. And back in that period, by the way, in the city of Shanghai, there was one international telephone line in the entire city that I could use to call home. We would take a cab to the Huping Hotel every weekend because there was one in the entire city which I could call home. And last time last time I flew to Shanghai or China from the United States, after 14 hours nonstop, I picked up, my BlackBerry. By the time I got to the gate, I'd already sent 3 emails, right? And in the terminal, I'd made calls. So changed the meaning. But this is a famous place in Shanghai. I found this picture from 1983. It's called the Bund. This is a picture from 1983. It's the same place today. So this is 1983. And that's the same place today.
But how did you even get in that game in the first
place? Well, from a technical standpoint, we get a kind of procedural standpoint, we got in that, we're here because the company that's doing this applied for a permit. There was work done on an environmental impact assessment. And the State Department looked at this, and this, about a week ago, I guess, or a couple days ago, announced that they were not satisfied with that environmental impact assessment. And so there's going to be a more thorough review. So we'll see where that goes and how that comes out. You look unsatisfied. Tell me why. Right.
It's really backwards thinking. It's not actually going to be weaning ourselves off that oil dependency, that heroin addiction for a little bit longer, and it just does not make sense.
I completely agree that we need to wean ourselves from the addiction on oil. I've done spent a lot of my recent career on this. I think the most important way to do that, in my view, is something I talked about in my remarks, which is we need vehicles that don't run on oil. As long as we have a growing global transportation fleet that depends on oil, the pressure to develop oil is going to be amazing. China is 17 million cars last year sold, and that's only going to grow. And it's going to grow in India, and so we need vehicles that run on something other than oil. That, in my view, is the most important step. If this huge demand for oil is out there, let's hope it comes from more sustainable places and not less sustainable places. Let's hope it comes from places where we don't need to destroy forests in order to get it. But if that huge demand for oil is out there, we're still going to be burning that oil, and it's going to be, putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we need to move to a world in which we have different types of vehicles. That's my view. Yeah.
I'm used to hear the conversations of DOE around nuclear since Japan, where they were headed.
This is one. Secretary Chu is a very strong believer in nuclear power, nuclear energy. I'm guessing that number of people here might disagree with that, but let me tell you, I can explain why. It's largely because nuclear power creates huge amounts of energy with almost no greenhouse gas emissions. And the demand for energy in this world is huge. And we need to be doing things to improve energy efficiency all around the world. But even when you do that, there's going to be huge demand for electric energy. And nuclear power can do that without creating greenhouse gas emissions. I look at, if you compare, for example, coal and nuclear, it's pretty striking in terms of, for example, just the sickness and death caused by one type of energy source over the other. We know that every year around the world, literally tens of thousands of people die from the particulate emissions from coal plants. And nuclear power just as nothing. We've had a couple with accident in Fukushima, which caused some. It's obviously an extremely serious incident, but nothing like that with nuclear power. So there are real significant challenges with nuclear power today. Probably the most significant challenge is cost. It is an expensive source of power today. But that's one reason we're doing research in lowering the cost of smaller nuclear reactors that might have a possibility for more sustainably providing energy at the Department of Energy. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think there's, nuclear energy does not create air pollution. The waste problems at this point are pretty well managed. We have spent nuclear fuel in a lot of places around around this country without real problems. So although there are risks there, there's risk in any source of energy source, and so what we're doing is working to manage the risks. In the 1990s, when I was working on this issue as a staff person in the White House, it was really the environmental community was the only constituency that was working on this. And the environmental community is very important, but in order to get anything done in Washington, D.C., you need lots of different types of interest groups to mobilize. And so by 2008, 2009, it wasn't just the environmental community that was talking about climate change. It was big business. I mean, we had major American corporations, Walmart, General Electric, Duke Power, lots of others coming and saying, please take action on global warming. We had huge contingent of retired military officers, admirals, generals come and say, this is a big national security issue. You've got to take this on. And so we had farmers coming and saying, there's huge potential for us here. And so I think this big coalition almost got over the line. And, just a brief digression, our founding fathers, and they were all fathers, our founding fathers intentionally designed a political system that would make it hard to get things done. They thought about it. If you read the Federalist Papers, that was part of the original conception. They wanted to make it hard to get things done in Washington, D.C. They didn't have this filibuster in mind, by the way, so I don't think they quite had it in mind that it would be this hard. But it's part of our scheme. So that mobilization really tried, didn't quite get over the line, and I think right now, frankly, they're a little deflated, that coalition. People if you try so hard and you don't get over the line, it's hard to get up and go again. One of the reasons I'm coming out and talking to groups like yours and others is because we got to get the energy back and do it. We've got to push. We absolutely have to do it. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time. And then I think the coalition will start to pull together again. The sad reality is that events are going to point the arrow in this direction. I mean, we've seen severe weather events all over the world. We've seen the reality of climate change. It's relentless. And so I think the coalition will come together, and I think we'll get it done. Thanks very much.